I never considered myself paranoid. I've always been a logical, grounded guy. But what happened on that cruise? I still can't explain it, and trust me, I've tried. It was a week-long cruise to the Caribbean, a much-needed getaway for my wife, Emily, and me. We'd been together for 10 years, married for 5, and between work, bills, and just life, we were exhausted. This was our chance to unplug and enjoy each other's company without distractions. On our second night, we were seated for dinner with another couple, Jake and Melissa. They were around our age, early 30s, and we hit it off immediately. Jake was outgoing, the kind of guy who could make friends in an empty room, while Melissa was quieter, more observant but warm. They had this easy chemistry between them, like they just got each other. We spent the whole dinner talking about everything. Our jobs, our travel experiences, even stupid little things like our favorite movies. By the end of the meal, we were already making plans to grab drinks at one of the ship's bars the next night. Emily and I were actually excited. It's rare to meet people on vacation who feel like old friends right away. So the next night, we got ready, headed to the bar, and waited. And waited. Jake and Melissa never showed. At first, we figured maybe they got held up, maybe lost track of time. But an hour passed, then 2. No texts, no messages, nothing. We finally gave up and called it a night, assuming we'd run into them at breakfast or by the pool the next day. But we didn't. The next morning, I asked the concierge if they could call their room. I didn't have their cabin number, so I just gave their names. The staff member, a young guy who looked barely old enough to be working on the ship, gave me a confused look. "I'm sorry, sir. We don't have anyone by that name on board." I laughed, thinking it was a mistake. "No, Jake and Melissa. They were at our table last night in the dining hall." He checked the list again, shook his head. No passengers with those names. That didn't make sense. I went to the dining hall, found the hostess from the night before, and asked if she remembered them. She frowned. "I remember you and your wife, but you were alone at your table." "What? No, we weren't." I let out a short laugh, expecting her to correct herself. "We were with Jake and Melissa. We were talking the whole time." She shook her head. "No, sir. It was just you two." I thought maybe she was mixing us up with another couple, so I checked the reservation list myself. Our table was listed for 2, not 4. At this point, I was frustrated but mostly confused. Maybe their names had been entered wrong? Maybe they checked in under different names? I had no idea, but I wasn't about to let it go. I dragged Emily with me to their cabin, or at least the cabin they told us they were staying in. When I knocked, a middle-aged couple opened the door. I asked them if Jake and Melissa had stayed there before, and they looked at me like I was insane. "We've been in this cabin since we boarded," the man said. I was starting to feel like I was losing my mind. I asked around, but no one seemed to remember them. Not the bartender, not the other people sitting near us in the dining hall, no one. It was like they never existed. Emily tried to reason with me. "Maybe they gave us fake names," she said. "Maybe they snuck on board somehow and got caught. I don't know, but they were real. That was the thing. They were real." I remember Jake laughing so hard at one of my stupid jokes that he nearly choked on his drink. I remember the way Melissa twirled her hair when she talked. I remember their voices, their faces, the way they looked at each other. I remember them, so why didn't anyone else? I was done playing games. I went to guest services and asked to see the security footage from the dining hall that night. At first, they pushed back, but I guess I seemed desperate enough that they finally agreed. I sat in that tiny back office with a security officer while he pulled up the footage. He skipped to the time we were seated, and there we were, me and Emily, alone. The officer glanced at me. "What exactly are you looking for?" I leaned forward, staring at the screen. "Keep playing it." He let it roll. I watched myself laughing, talking, gesturing animatedly, at nothing. Emily was nodding, responding, to empty chairs. "No Jake, no Melissa." I felt sick. "Sir," the officer was watching me now, cautious. "Are you feeling okay?" I had no answer for him. I stumbled out of the office, back to our cabin, where Emily was waiting. I told her what I saw. She went pale. But But we both saw them. We talked to them. I know. We barely spoke for the rest of the trip. We didn't try to bring it up again. What was there to say? The moment we docked, we left that ship as fast as we could. To this day, I don't know what happened. Were Jake and Melissa ever real? Did we hallucinate the whole thing? Were we drugged? I have no answers. I work as a housekeeper on a cruise ship, and I've seen my fair share of weird things. People forget all kinds of stuff in their rooms, leave behind strange messes, and sometimes guests just act plain bizarre. But nothing, and I mean nothing, has ever creeped me out as much as what happened in Suite 733. Suite 733 had been empty since the ship left port. I knew this because it was assigned as an out-of-order room from the start of the trip. Sometimes, rooms are marked this way if they need repairs or deep cleaning. So, when my supervisor handed me a last-minute task to clean it, I thought maybe it was finally being prepped for a new guest. No big deal. Except when I got there, my key card didn't work. I tried 3 times before calling maintenance, thinking it was a glitch. That's when they told me something odd. Suite 733 had been sealed off due to a past incident. I asked what kind of incident, but all I got was a vague response about a previous issue. Now, normally I would have just shrugged it off and moved on. But something about the way the maintenance guy spoke made my skin crawl, like he didn't want to say too much. Still, I had work to do, so I let it go and went about my day. Later that night, I stepped out onto the deck for a break. The sea was calm, the wind cool, and I could see the rows of balcony rooms stretching along the side of the ship. That's when I noticed it. A single light was on inside Suite 733. I stood frozen, staring at the window. That room was supposed to be empty. Nobody had checked in. Nobody was allowed inside. And yet, the warm yellow glow of a bedside lamp flickered behind the curtains. I grabbed my radio and called security, reporting what I saw. A minute later, a guard radioed back, sounding confused. He told me the power was completely off in that section. I told him to come check for himself. By the time he arrived, the light was off. The guard gave me a weird look, like I was wasting his time, and mumbled something about reporting it if I saw it again. But I wasn't imagining it. I know what I saw. That should have been the end of it. But something gnawed at me. I couldn't stop thinking about the room. Why had it been sealed off? Why had the light turned on? And if nobody had access, then how was there a light on at all? So, the next day, I did something I probably shouldn't have. I found the ship's maintenance schematics and looked for another way into 733. Turns out, a maintenance passage runs behind a section of rooms, including that one. Technically, only engineers and higher-ups were supposed to use it, but I figured if I just took a quick peek, nobody would know. That night, after my shift, I snuck in. The passage was dark, musty, and smelled like old cleaning supplies. I walked carefully, my heart pounding, until I reached the access door for Suite 733. I hesitated for just a second before pushing it open. The room was spotless. The bed was perfectly made. The air smelled faintly of fresh linen, and everything looked completely normal, except for one thing. On the small table near the window sat a silver tray with a half-eaten meal. The food was old, congealed, like it had been sitting there for days. But that was impossible. No one had been in this room. Nobody had checked in. Nobody had brought food in. My stomach dropped. A cold rush of air brushed against my neck, and I swear, for a second, I felt like I wasn't alone, like someone was standing right behind me. I turned so fast I nearly tripped, but the room was empty. I bolted out of there, heart slamming against my ribs. I practically ran back to my quarters, locking the door behind me, and tried to shake off the feeling that something was very, very wrong. Couldn't let it go. The next day, I went into the ship's archives. It took some digging, but eventually, I found it. A report from 5 years ago. A guest had stayed in Suite 733. He was last seen entering his room on the 3rd night of the voyage. Security footage confirmed that no one else went in or out. And yet, by morning, he was gone. The room was locked from the inside. His belongings were still there. His shoes, his wallet, even his half-eaten dinner sitting right where I had seen it. He was never found. The ship docked. Investigators combed through everything, but no one could explain how he disappeared. The case was eventually closed due to insufficient evidence. The room was marked as off-limits after that. I didn't sleep that night. Couldn't, because now I knew the truth. Suite 733 wasn't empty. It never was. So last summer, my friends and I went on a week-long cruise. It wasn't some fancy, 5-star ship, just a normal mid-tier cruise line with decent food and a lot of drunk tourists. We booked it as a fun way to unwind, drink, and party. Nothing crazy. But from the very first night, something about that ship felt off. It started with me just being stupidly curious. The second night, after a few drinks, I decided to explore the ship on my own. I wasn't doing anything weird, just walking around, seeing if there were any cool places I hadn't noticed yet. At some point, I ended up at a door with a small employees-only sign on it. It wasn't locked or anything, just slightly ajar. And yeah, I know I should have turned around, but my tipsy brain thought, what's the harm in taking a quick look? The hallway beyond the door looked totally normal. Just a bunch of narrow, slightly dimly lit corridors, not much different from the rest of the ship. I only took a few steps inside before I heard footsteps. A crew member, a tall guy in a crisp uniform, appeared out of nowhere. He didn't yell, didn't ask questions. He just looked at me with this dead serious expression and said, "You need to leave, now." I mumbled some excuse, turned around, and left. That should have been the end of it, right? But that guy, something about him unsettled me. His uniform looked old, slightly different from the others. And when I told my friends about it later that night, one of them joked, "Are you sure he was real? Maybe you saw a ghost." The next day, I kept an eye out for him. The crew wasn't huge, you tend to see the same people over and over again. But no matter where I looked, I never saw that guy again. It started to bug me. I mean, where did he go? Was he even a real crew member? That's when my curiosity got the best of me. I spent the next couple of days casually wandering the ship, trying to find that same door. But here's the weird thing, it was gone. I knew exactly where I had been that night, but now, in that same spot, there was just a blank wall. No door. No employees-only sign. Nothing. By the fourth night, I was starting to feel like I had imagined the whole thing. Maybe I'd just been drunk. Maybe I'd stumbled into a part of the ship that was normally accessible but looked different at night. I was about to drop it completely until I saw them. It was around 2 a.m., and I was coming back from the casino when I noticed a small group of crew members heading towards a maintenance hatch near the lower deck. They weren't talking, just moving with quiet purpose. Something about their behavior felt secretive, like they didn't want to be noticed. Without thinking, I followed them at a distance. They reached the hatch, unlocked it with a keycard, and disappeared inside. The door swung shut behind them, but I saw enough to know that there was another set of stairs leading even further down. Now, here's the part where I should have walked away, but I didn't. Instead, I waited a few minutes, then crept up to the hatch. I pressed my ear against it, listening. Silence. Then, very faintly, I heard something. Voices murmuring in a language I didn't understand. And then, laughter. But not the kind of laughter you hear at a bar or a party. It was soft, almost rehearsed, like people pretending to enjoy themselves. My heart was pounding, but I couldn't just leave. I pulled out my phone and, with shaking hands, cracked the door open just enough to snap a photo. I didn't even look at the screen. I just clicked the shutter and bolted. Back in my room, I finally dared to check the picture. My stomach dropped. The photo showed a long, dimly lit corridor, completely different from the rest of the ship. And there were people. Some in crew uniforms, some in regular passenger clothing, just standing there, facing away from the camera. None of them were moving. I didn't sleep that night. In the morning, I went straight to security. I tried to sound casual, like I had just stumbled onto something weird and wanted to report it. The guy at the desk nodded, took my phone, and opened my photo gallery. I watched his expression shift from mild curiosity to something unreadable. Then he handed my phone back. The picture was gone. "Be careful where you wander," he said, his tone flat. "Enjoy the rest of your trip." I went back to my room, shaken but still trying to convince myself I was overreacting. But when I got to my door, my keycard didn't work. I swiped it again. Nothing. I had to go to guest services to get it reactivated. And the guy at the desk just smiled and said, "Looks like your card got deactivated. Happens sometimes." That night, as I was getting into bed, I heard a soft rustling sound. I turned on the light. There was a small slip of paper pushed under my door. In neat, printed letters, it said, "Stop asking questions." I barely slept the last 2 nights of the trip. I didn't try to investigate any further, didn't talk about it with my friends, didn't even take any more pictures. I just wanted to make it home in one piece. I used to be in the Navy, spent most of my life on ships, enough to know every inch of how they work. It's been years since I retired, but some habits never die. One of them, counting lifeboats. I was on a cruise, just a little solo trip to unwind. Nothing fancy, just a mid-range liner sailing through the Caribbean. On the second day, I was leaning against the railing, watching the waves, when I started counting. It wasn't conscious at first, just an old reflex. 1, 2, 3. Then I did a quick estimate of the passengers. That's when I realized something was off. There weren't enough lifeboats. Now, most people wouldn't even notice, but I knew the regulations. For the number of people on board, there should have been at least double what I counted. I figured maybe I'd missed a section, so I walked around, checked the other side. Still short. I flagged down a crew member, a young guy in a crisp white uniform. I kept it casual, just asked, "Hey, where are the rest of the lifeboats?" He gave me a weird look, like he didn't understand the question. Then he smiled, that rehearsed customer service smile, and said, "Don't worry, sir. Everything is up to code." I wasn't convinced. I pushed a little, but he just kept repeating the same vague reassurance before excusing himself. That didn't sit right with me. A properly trained crew member should know the exact lifeboat capacity without hesitation. That night, when most of the passengers were at the casino or drunk at the bar, I went exploring. I found a maintenance hatch that led to a lower deck, and that's when I saw them. A row of lifeboats, hidden away where no one would casually see them. But they were in terrible shape. Some were rusted through at the seams. Others were missing crucial parts, oars, emergency supplies, even basic flotation devices. They were there just for show, useless in an actual emergency. I felt a pit in my stomach. This wasn't just laziness or cost-cutting. This was deliberate. I needed to know more, so I headed toward the bridge, hoping to find some documents or a ship registry. Obviously, they wouldn't leave that stuff lying around, but I had an idea. The crew deck had a small lounge with a bulletin board, and sometimes ships post emergency protocols there. What I found instead chilled me to the bone. A laminated blueprint of the ship. Except, the name on it wasn't the same as the one on my ticket. In fact, the company name wasn't one I recognized at all. I pulled out my phone and started searching online. Nothing. No record of this ship, no history, no ownership details. This wasn't just some sketchy cruise line cutting corners. This ship wasn't supposed to exist. I took pictures, as many as I could, and rushed back to my cabin. I needed to report this, get in touch with someone on land. But before I could even send a message, there was a knock at my door. Not a friendly, casual knock. A slow, deliberate one. I opened it to find the captain standing there. Not some junior officer or security guy. The captain himself. He was an older man, sharp eyes, perfectly pressed uniform. And he was smiling. "Mr. Tanner," he said, "we need to have a word." I don't know how he knew my name. I hadn't introduced myself to anyone in the crew. My gut told me to play dumb. "Sure, Captain, what's up?" He stepped inside without being invited. Closed the door behind him. "We appreciate guests who take an interest in maritime safety," he said. "But I'd hate for you to misunderstand things. Everything is in perfect order." His tone was polite, but there was something underneath it. A warning. I forced a chuckle. Hey, no worries. Just an old sailor's curiosity. I'm sure everything's fine. He nodded slowly, like he was deciding whether to believe me. Enjoy the rest of your trip, Mr. Tanner. Then he left. I didn't sleep that night. Every instinct was screaming at me that I'd just been threatened. I decided that first thing in the morning, I'd go straight to the Port Authority when we docked and hand over the photos. But when I woke up, the ship was different. The name on the welcome brochures in my cabin had changed. The logo on the towels, the uniforms of the staff, it was all different. Like the ship had rebranded overnight. I rushed out to the deck, trying to find a familiar crew member. But the faces were different. The friendly young guy I talked to the day before? Nowhere in sight. The staff acted like they'd never seen me before. I ran to the concierge desk, demanded to see my booking confirmation. The clerk gave me a blank stare. Sir, we don't have a record of you booking this cruise. I pulled up my email to show proof, but my confirmation was gone. The emails, the payment receipts, everything. Like I'd never bought a ticket at all. I was trapped on a ship that wasn't supposed to exist, with no proof I'd ever been on it. And we were still days away from land. I've been working as a bartender on this cruise ship for a little over a year now. It's a good gig, decent money, free room and board, and I get to travel. It's not as glamorous as people think, but I've met some cool people along the way. One of them was Marco. Marco was one of the other bartenders on the ship, and he'd been here a bit longer than me. We weren't best friends or anything, but we got along well. He was one of those guys who just made the long shifts easier. Always had a joke, always helped clean up when things got crazy. The kind of coworker you actually looked forward to seeing. So when he didn't show up for his shift one night, I figured something was off. I covered for him, assuming maybe he got sick or overslept. It happens. But Marco wasn't the kind of guy to flake. When my shift ended, I went to his cabin to check on him. Knocked a few times. No answer. Okay, weird. The next morning, I asked around. No one seemed to think it was a big deal. My manager just said, maybe he disembarked at the last port, which was weird because we weren't even in a port when he went missing. And wouldn't someone have noticed if a crew member just left in the middle of the night? I went back to his cabin. His name wasn't on the door anymore. I actually thought maybe I got the room number wrong. But no, this was definitely his cabin. And it was empty. Like, completely empty. The bed was stripped. The closet was bare. No sign anyone had ever lived there. I checked the crew lounge, the dining hall, the gym, anywhere he might be. Nothing. And here's where it started getting really weird. When I asked people about him, most of them just stared at me blankly. Marco? They'd say. Who's that? At first, I thought maybe they were messing with me. But then I realized they really didn't remember him. Not my manager, not the other bartenders, not the cleaning staff. It was like Marco never existed. Now, I don't consider myself paranoid. But this freaked me out. I went to the employee locker room, thinking maybe his stuff was still there. But his locker was empty. Like, not just emptied out. Like it had never been assigned to anyone. No name tag, no sign it had ever been used. At this point, I needed proof I wasn't losing my mind. We have security cameras in the bar, so I figured I'd check the footage from the last few nights. I asked the security guy if I could take a look. He barely glanced at me and said, "What are you looking for?" I hesitated. "Just checking something from last night's shift." He sighed but let me into the room. He pulled up the footage and handed me the mouse. I fast-forwarded to my last shift with Marco, and he wasn't there. Every moment I remembered working with him, mixing drinks, talking to guests, cleaning up, he was just gone. The footage showed me working alone, even though I knew he had been there. At one point, I saw myself laughing and talking to empty space, like a crazy person. I stared at the screen, my stomach twisting. There's supposed to be another bartender there," I said. The security guy leaned over, squinting. "Doesn't look like it." I opened my mouth to argue but stopped. He wasn't surprised. He wasn't confused. He just looked indifferent. like this was normal. I didn't sleep that night. The next day, I decided to check the crew records. We have an office where all that stuff is kept, but it's off limits unless you have a reason to be in there. I made up some excuse about checking my contract details and managed to get in while the admin guy was distracted. I found the employee roster and started scanning the names. No Marco. Not under bartenders, not under kitchen staff, nowhere. It was like he had been erased. But here's the part that really made my blood run cold. I flipped through the past records trying to find him, and that's when I noticed a pattern. Every few months, a name disappeared. Always a crew member, never a passenger. I counted at least 8 names over the past 2 years. People who had worked here, lived here, and then just vanished. Then I saw something worse. A section labeled, Next Scheduled Removal. There was only one name listed. Mine. The date? Tomorrow. I felt like I was going to be sick. I took out my phone to take a picture, but the second I did, I heard a noise behind me. I turned, and my manager was standing in the doorway. "You shouldn't be in here," she said, voice calm. Too calm. I didn't say anything. I just put the file back and walked past her, trying to act normal, trying to pretend I hadn't just seen what I saw. That was this morning. Right now, I'm sitting in my cabin, writing this down because I don't know what else to do. I don't know if I'll even be here tomorrow. I don't know what happens to the people on that list. But I think I'm about to find out.